Welcome to another edition of the Best Business Minds, where we interview business leaders and academics who write thought-provoking books. I'm Marc Kramer, serial entrepreneur who consults with family businesses and entrepreneurs, and currently I'm teaching entrepreneurship at Vinh University in Hanoi, Vietnam. Today's guest is Kari Zeller, author of the book Replaced: Answering the Call of Leadership in the Age of AI. And this book is perfect for this time. My students my students, the faculty, the leadership are all struggling with this and how to deal with it. So, Kari, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mark.
And so, before we dive into the book, I'd like you to give us your background, your professional background, about how you got to where you're at right now and why you wrote this book.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me start with the last question. Why I wrote this book. I was compelled to write the book. And a couple reasons. One, my daughter. So I look into the future and I say, well, what future is there for my daughter? And what future is there for my daughter's children, should she be able to and decide to have them? And I got a bit concerned. And then I realized, well, I had something to say about it. In 2021, I wasn't really sure, but I knew that there was a lot of uncertainty happening. And I knew that I could raise my hand to be a helper. I had a perspective to contribute. My background is, well, I'm a combat vet, and I graduated from the Air Force Academy. And I was so intrigued by leadership back then. And the reason I was so intrigued is going to the Air Force Academy, I spent 4 years in the dorms in which there's 40 identical squadrons. We had, randomly assigned the same kind of resources. Everything was the same, yet some squadrons would perform remarkably better than others year after year after year. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. What's different about that? And then I was deployed to Iraq, Kuwait, and then I would go into Iraq. And I noticed that what I had been taught in an academic setting really hadn't prepared me in the way that I needed to be prepared to truly lead in those very complex and certain environments. And what had prepared me was like this training in being, like how can you be courageous when what's there is fear? Less okay, here's a decision-making framework, or here's the steps to be a great leader. So I got really interested in that. And over time, I developed a different way of really creating the being of being a leader. Fast forward, when I ended up leaving the military, I founded TGN Consulting. It was a different name back then. And we began with leadership development. And as I started developing leaders, I realized, well, hey, if the culture doesn't support the leaders, then, whatever we develop them in isn't going to take. And then I realized, well, I really got to learn culture. So then culture and leadership came together. And once that was solid, I realized, well, if we don't have a clear, sharp strategy, what am I developing the leaders for, right? So then I had to learn strategy. So I got those couple things done. Not done, but developed the expertise around it. And things were going pretty well. And I realized, well, gosh, you can have a sharp strategy, a leadership team that has the right kind of practices to enact it. You can have a culture that supports it, but then you can have really stupid structures in which, you're making it hard for good people with good intent to do good work, because they got to do all sorts of workarounds and they have to work harder given that kind of structure. So we put all that together, and we've called that the leadership operating system. Now, where does that get applied? It gets applied in mobilizing the workforce around big change. And that's really what I do today. So whether it's an M&A, a reorg, a big strategic pivot, what are CEOs and executive teams really working with? Leadership, culture, strategy, structure, all at once. They don't have these things as separate endeavors for themselves, although they will hire different consultants. but rather we're looking at that whole coherency and what needs to shift as you move directions as a business. And that's my work.
So, Kari, did you go to the Air Force
I
Academy?
did. I did. Yeah.
How many years were you in the Air Force?
Uh, Ultimately, I was in just shy of 10 years. You know, I,
And thank you for your service. What
Mhm.
did you do in the Air Force?
Yeah, I was an aircraft maintenance officer. So I
Okay.
had a pilot slot and I thought, wow, it's kind of sexy actually for a
Yeah.
female, and I could have gone into the Euro NATO jet fighter slot.
Yeah.
And I thought, it's going to be a really long time before I really get to lead. And so as a top graduate, I chose aircraft maintenance because that was a field that you could go right into and you would be confronted with these complex leadership challenges right away. So that's what I did.
I think most people, especially guys, definitely would have chosen get in a fighter jet, right? I mean, because that would be like cool, you know, lots of
Totally.
attraction from other people that would want that. But when you really think about it, and I guess I'm 65, if my students said to me and gave me those options, I would probably say to them what you chose. Because
Yeah.
if you were looking for a leader and you wanted to show companies when you left the military that you had the ability to lead, there would be a lot of companies who would say, well, that's really germane to operations or whatever, and you would
Hmm.
get hired. I mean, obviously,
Hmm.
some guys would get hired because just guys want to hang out with fighter pilots, and they have their own set of skills. But if
Oh,
you're
for
really
sure.
thinking about running an operation and managing people and putting people in the right place to be successful, probably what you chose was probably the smart thing to go and do.
Yeah, I think so. And, I actually had to explain my choice ad nauseum to the higher ups because the default answer is, of course, that's what you want to do. And it's what I wanted to do for 3 out of the 4 years until I really realized I have a passion for what does it take to really mobilize people toward something. And so aircraft maintenance was the perfect fit.
Are you still in and we'll get into the book. Are you still connected with the Air Force?
Here and there as a client.
Yeah. So I wonder if they're keeping up with the latest ways of developing leadership in the AI era. Are they, I mean, I know that clearly they're using drones and all the other
Yeah,
technology, but are they keeping up with how to manage in
I
the
don't know.
AI era?
Yeah, I really don't know. I'm not involved at that level at this time. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. I'm just curious about that. So let's get into your book. You
Mhm.
begin the book with stories of leaders facing existential change. Why did you feel vulnerability was the right place to start a conversation about AI?
Yeah, well, not a lot of people are looking there, right? And
Yeah.
I think artificial intelligence, and we might get into it later, it's not just AI, it's quantum computing, it's biotech, it's robotics, it's all these different exponential technologies that are converging together at this time, right? And when you really look at it, it's not like any technology we've had before. It's exponential technology, right? And it's actually shifting the way we work, it's shifting the way we create, it's shifting the way we think, right? And so if you start to look at our way of life and the way we go about our jobs day to day, or even, I have a daughter and how much does she use AI in the classroom or not as her brain develops? I started to realize that there's something more fundamental here underneath the technology adoption questions. And what I think was more fundamental is our very way of life is shifting. We'll get into it more, I'm sure. One of the things that a lot of people take for granted is what work provides for people. So, work provides more than a paycheck for most of the Western world. Now, I am noticing shifts in in Gen Z a bit, but for most of the working world, work is the place in which we find our identity, right? So when somebody says, "What do you do?" they're not really asking, like, "Give me a rundown." They're really asking, "Who are you?" Right? And we answer with our work. That's our
I
identity.
I think so, and I think for men, that's the most important thing for them, or they have no identity. I've noticed over the years that even as successful as women have become, they still think if they have kids, still feel I'm a mom first and the work second. For the guys, when they lose their job, they literally like fall off a cliff, right?
Yep.
And all their self-confidence goes right out the window because their whole identity is built around whatever they do professional. I see in Asia, guys retire early and in their 50s, and it's not a great idea.
Well, it's interesting because part of my background is actually in working with transitions. And it started with wounded warriors coming back from hardship deployments. And what you would notice is while the public conversation was treatment, benefit, physical or mental injury, the real conversation underneath is, well, who am I now? What future's there for me? Where am I going to make a meaningful contribution? And then I saw it again in the last 20 years of work with corporations going through big change. And if you think about, I work in healthcare enough when it comes to acquisitions, and you think about, okay, I'm running my private practice in this local community, and there's a certain identity I have in this community. Then when I'm acquired by a national brand, I start to wonder those same things, right? I was a founder, a CEO, the doctor in my community, but now I'm just a middle manager, part of a national brand. And so that really disrupts people. And so how do you start to create a future for yourself when, your identity kind of gets shooken up? And at work with AI, our identity is getting shooken up, especially if we're knowledge workers, if our who we know ourselves as the expert, the most productive, that starts to shake us up.
Yeah, I tell my students now that you're in the most competitive time in the history of the world because not as only is the world flat and you compete against everybody against around the world, but now you're competing against the machine. And if you can't express your ideas in a group setting and show bosses why they should hire you over just the AI,
Mhm.
then you're in a world of trouble. And
Right.
the only thing that separates you from AI is your ability to be creative and put things together that maybe AI would not see as the same, and your ability to communicate and get people to work together that AI doesn't do either. So I thought your book
Yeah,
was super timely
thank
about
you.
why that's so important. What can today's leaders learn from Chief Crowfoot? And I'm not going to pronounce this right, Dormgam and Winston
Dermagon.
Churchill when facing uncertainty. So I think you have to explain the first two.
Yeah. I go into it a bit in my book. I was actually turned on with the Chief Crowfoot and the Blackfoot people. I was turned on to this idea from actually Jonathan Lehr's book, Radical Hope. And I'm practical business consultant, but I also have this interest in the philosophical practices of ontology and phenomenology, which nobody needs to worry about. Except that when I read this book, and he was speaking about the Crow Nation, and what he said was, look, Chief Plentycoo, when he was quoted, one of the last great chief of the Crow Nation, he said, "Look, when the buffalo went away, the hearts of my people fell to the ground, and after that, nothing happened." I thought, well, isn't that interesting? Nothing happened after that, and then I started to realize this was a chief who was faced with the end of a world, not like the physical world went away, but the bison was at the heart of their world, right? It wasn't just food. It wasn't just material, right? It was ceremony. It was coming of age. it was skill. There was a whole world around that. And so what Jonathan Lair talked about in his book, because I'm not going to pretend I know, I wasn't in that time period, and I'm certainly not Crow. Um, but what I started to realize was this whole way of life was coming to an end. And so I thought, well, isn't that interesting if you relate that to today? And I'm not equating the two, but this is a leader who was faced with the end of a way of life. And how does he lead his people from one world into the next, in which the next was undefined, it was uncertain. And so we can learn from what he was faced with. Now, he didn't have like a wide open opportunity like the rest of us at this moment. We do. We have a wide open opportunity in which we get a say. Rather, he had to make the best of a terrible situation. So then I thought, well, are there other tribes like that? And that was so. I in my book I talked about the Blackfoot people. There's something really important to study about that time, because it's not that nothing happened after the bison went away; it's that nothing really had meaning, right? And so, how do we actually create meaning as leaders and create a future in which our fundamental human cares and concerns of contribution, of meaning, of achievement, of belonging are addressed? So that's the first one. Mhm.
How much does tradition, like with the Indians, have factored into this kind of thinking for the leadership?
Uh, Let me see if I can understand kind of what you're saying. Factored into this condition, you mean the thinking inside the book of leadership?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, how does that factor in? Because a lot of, just like in Asia, there's a lot of it's based on tradition. We don't have that same tradition in the West that they have
yeah.
in these kinds of cultures.
Yeah. Well, I do I think that it's pretty hard to get it exact, because any real looking is a bit of a neo-colonialist perspective. I was even a bit shy to use those examples. Uh, I think that we do have tradition, and we have ways of thinking and ways of operating that we're not even really aware of. And I think that we'll start to see those more as they change, right? So, I am all the way into AI, and then I all of a sudden I realize, whoa, like my own way of creating and engaging is shifting. Right, my daughter's schooling is shifting, and we do have traditions. People teach our children, but they're not just teaching information, they're teaching character, they're teaching ways of interacting. And I don't think that we don't really know sometimes our own traditions in the modern world, but I think they're going to get highlighted more as things shift.
No question about it. You introduced the concept of uh, ontological vulnerability.
Yeah.
What is this different from ordinary business uncertainty?
Yeah. I think it's, ordinary business uncertainty. It isn't really ordinary business uncertainty is like, I don't know what's going to happen to the market. I don't know what's going to happen to uh, my workforce. I don't know what's going to happen. So I think a lot of ordinary business uncertainty tries to predict or anticipate what's going to happen so you can make the best move for your business. And I think dealing with uncertainty like that is crucial, 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 crucial. And in fact, the book talks about that. It talks about how do we orient ourselves to be able to take intelligible action when the future is uncertain. And I think that's important. Ontological vulnerability. So ontological means our being, our way of life. It's kind of like our place in the world, right? Our whole way. It's deeper. It's like I don't know who I'm going to become, and so I think that ontological vulnerability threatens the way people understand their worth, their competence, their status, their future. where, a spreadsheet or a forecast, you can't solve for that. So both are important, dealing with business uncertainty, but also being aware, right? That people are starting to question not just what will I do or what decision will I make, but will I matter? And that's the ontological vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think people are really worried about that if they're going to matter because they keep hearing from the leaders around the world, like Elon Musk and Bill Gates and others, that they really won't. And even those guys are saying, oh, 95% of the jobs will be replaced, which makes me wonder who will be buying any of their products if nobody is making a living. It's not like the old what's the George Jetson, where he would send his robot to work. Why would anybody be paying him to work if the robot's actually doing it? So it's going to be a much more tougher world, especially for the younger people to get through. Why do you
Well,
believe many leaders underestimate the identity challenges created by AI?
Uh, yeah, and just if I could comment on the last thing that you said, I
Yep.
think I think that's what's really important, also from a business uncertainty perspective, is that I we don't know what's going to happen, but there seems to be a different economy that's starting to show up. And so, if we are creating strategies in the old economy, we're not really paying attention to the historical drift and what is that new economy that's getting created, right? Will we own certain, and we want to start to use our imagination for that, right? Will we own agents and robots and we'll get compensated for the work of them? Or will there, like, I don't even know, but that's the kind of thinking that makes things very uncertain. So it's kind of like while I'm making decisions inside the old economy, I have to start to watch. And this is later on in the book, I talk about innovation not being, oh, a new idea, but more an attunement. And I learned this from one of my mentors, Fernando Flores, but the attunement to what's happening historically, right? So for example, the shift from you own the asset to actually you can own the platform in which assets are shared, like Airbnb or Uber, right? That was a huge shift. And so there's something shifting that we have to pay attention to so that we can innovate consistent with that new economy. So I just wanted to comment on the last. Then you asked me about why we're under S
Why
why
do leaders underestimate the identity challenges created by AI?
Yeah, well, I think leaders have always underestimated the identity challenges by any change. So, why I rose my hand and say, okay, I have something to say about this is because I've worked in big change mobilization for over 2 decades. And leaders consistently miss the identity transitions, consistently. They're trained to see roles, they're trained to see structures, processes, cost centers, synergies, deals, org charts. They're trained to see certain things. They might say, oh, you know, AI is just automating the workflow. But what people are hearing is, wait a second, I've built my entire professional worth around something that may no longer matter, right? So it's the same thing that has M&A deals fall short of their promised value over and over. Like, why did everybody leave? Well, because you didn't replace those people into a future that gave them an opportunity to contribute in a way that matters. So leaders have always underestimated the identity challenge. And what they're looking at is value creation. They're looking at, how do I put the parts and the pieces and the workflow and the structure? How do I put this whole map together to create more value? They're not necessarily looking at the humans in that map operate very differently than anything else in that map. So we've always missed it, actually. That's why I have a job.
In chapter two, possible AI futures, why is it important for leaders to explore multiple AI futures instead of trying to predict a single outcome?
Well, I think that's a basic strategy question, right? And forecast, foresight. You should always look at many possible different futures. AI is not a straight line. It's converging with other technologies that are also exponential. We don't we don't have an a common sense that's exponential. Our common sense is actually pretty linear. So when we look to predict a future, it's a linear way of making sense, but things are exponential now. So I think it's good resilient practice regardless if it's AI or not to explore several possible future scenarios because it increases our strategic range. It helps us see weak signals. It helps us test assumptions. Um, it helps us create different contingency plans. It's something we do with people, regardless of AI. The executive teams we work with on about a quarterly basis is we're looking at what are the possible different scenarios here and what are some non-regrettable moves today, right? Regardless of that scenario. Yeah.
Are
It's
there any companies that you've observed that are really doing this well, or even just doing it?
uh yeah, I mean a number, I think there's a lot of companies that are doing it well. Um I think actually the military, at least the US military is actually quite good at it. They're always looking at scenario planning and what's the range of possible outcomes that can happen here. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad to hear our military is prepared for this. Which potential future described in the book concerns you the most and why?
You mean in the possible AI futures?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I actually used AI to create these possible futures. Super intelligence. That's the one that the particular now, any of these, they're like three scenarios, right? Artificial narrow intelligence, general intelligence, and super intelligence. And within those three, these are not like this is how it's going to be. It's like one of infinite possibilities. But the one that I do describe in the book concerns me the most because it's like we almost become a protected species, right? So it flips from humans creating futures, creating context, doing the orchestration, to AI doing that, super intelligence, and from AI performing the tasks to humans doing what you're told, right? We become shepherds in that story. And sure, we get food, we get a place to live, we get adequate clothing, but we don't get a palette to create our life. There's not diversity, there's sameness, right? There's not really individual identity. There's not striving, ambition, contribution, solving problems. AI solved our problems. And so I think it really comes into question, especially the techno optimists, which I'm part of some of those groups, right? Is utopia really utopia? Right? Can you have joy without the struggle, the pain, the uncertainty, the work? Do you get to experience joy when you don't have any of that? Anyway, that's the one that really, really concerns me.
What assumptions about work and leadership are most likely to be challenged by AI?
Well, I think we talked about this a little bit at the top of the podcast. I think many people assume work is where they get their paycheck. Uh, and for some people, that's true. I think for the majority of us, it's and I might overstep in this saying it's a metaphor. It's not meaning to be equal, but I do ask the question: is work our modern day buffalo, in which we don't know how much it's holding of our place in life, of our identity, our contribution, our opportunity to achieve, to find status. We might not like a particular job, but work is the place where many of us imagine our future, or at least as a pathway to the futures we imagine. And I think people really don't understand how important work is beyond a paycheck. Um, Leadership, I think, uh, I think leadership, I mean, there's so many definitions of leadership. I looked at one point, I was giving a keynote, and it was like billions of books or hits on the internet for leadership, which, one of my mentors always said, if you have like billions of books on a topic, it means we don't really know what we're talking about. There's like two on like quantum physics or something, right? But leadership, I think, has always been used as somebody who charts the future, who has the answers and manages the present. I don't think that's ever really been leadership. I think the importance now is of being willing to author, to co-create a future, to stand and say, okay, we need to author our future, to take a stand on what's ethical, what's going to remain. Um, yeah, so I think leadership is misunderstood, period, right?
In chapter three, Replaced or Replaced, the title of your book hinges on the difference between being replaced and being replaced in another position. How
Mhm.
do you define the distinction?
Yeah, I would say being replaced is like displaced. Like I'm going to replace this cup with another cup. And many people are being replaced, actually. Their jobs, their roles are being replaced by AI. And of course, the book does a play on that. The leader's job now, and this is going to sound like the great man theory. I don't really mean it to, but our job as leaders is to create a future in which people can replace themselves. So they find a new place for themselves. And that's the distinction. So, how do I put myself into a future that calls to me?
And isn't what the best leaders trying to do is work their way out of each position into a different position to provide more value?
Uh, yes. And I think that for many of us, we we're still kind of in that same trajectory, right? So of course I want to put myself into the next. That's kind of like, I think what you're talking about is growing in that. I don't know if it's
Yeah.
a career ladder, but growing in that particular trajectory. There's a future there that makes sense to me. There's a context for work. There's a context for growth and ambition, and that is, I do this job, and then I do enough to prove my value that I could be good to the next job, and then I compete for the next job. But I think what's happening is we have to start to really look at we're not just creating value in the market for now, right? We have to start to think like, what kind of value do we want to create in that future such that humans are going to be interested in that and can participate in that? And so, yeah, you can use it in a small place, like replace myself in this job, but that's more like I'm going to move myself out and move another person in, right? Or I'm going to replace the next person in the role. That's not really what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about, um, well, you think about people who retire, at what you were speaking about earlier with the Asian culture, and it happens in all cultures, right? Which is, I've had an entire career of contributing. I mean, imagine like a military general or a university president or somebody who's been in the corporate world or, 30, 40, 50 years. And then they retire and they're like, well, who am I now? What future am I building now? Like, am I just going towards death? Right. And then
Yeah.
you see disease happen, you see cognitive decline happen, you see mental health decline. So their job in that moment is to actually create, well, what's the next future that's worth, my effort towards? And that next future could be one of family, it could be one of, um, it could be volunteer, it could be mentorship, but it's really important as when one future starts to disappear for us or starts to come to a close, that we actually invent for ourselves what's this next era going to be about for ourselves so that our actions start to have meaning, right? If community,
I,
local community is that, I need to start taking different kinds of actions.
I think that's why it's a hard transition for professional athletes at
Yeah.
such a young age to transition out of what they've been doing since they were little kids. And now
Yeah.
all of a sudden they have to think about a whole new career for themselves.
Absolutely. I had the same thing leaving the military. I mean, I was really someone there. You can in the military, you can clean toilets and you feel like you're fighting for freedom. But that same job at like I'm not going to use a name, but company
Right.
X,
Yeah.
it's like I'm a nobody all of a sudden, right? That's why
Yeah.
context is so important, right? And that's why we have a whole chapter dedicated to that.
What mindset shifts must leaders make to consciously reposition themselves in the AI era?
Yeah, I think it's okay to ask the questions like, what can AI do faster, cheaper, better? But I think leaders want to start asking different kinds of questions like, what does AI make newly possible for human beings? What new kind of value can we create now that we have, it's not just AI, but it's these other technologies as well. Um, we have to shift from protecting the old identity, which you actually see with the one of the scenarios at the beginning of the book, Dermagum. But we have to shift from protecting the old identity to a mindset of authoring a new one. That's the shift. We have to realize something's ending, and it's our job now to begin to think what's beginning, and how can I start to author and shape that.
Why do some people see AI primarily as a threat while others see it as an opportunity?
Well, from the traditions I've studied in, people will interpret anything to include AI through the context they're already living in. I mean, um, people see somebody cutting you off on the highway as either like a real asshole with intent, or
Yep.
my God, they didn't see me there, or they're on the way to deliver a baby, right? Like people interpret things through their already existing context. And I think AI is no exception. So, if my identity or my context is I'm someone because I'm the expert, and all of a sudden AI can produce, I mean, maybe not exactly, but a pretty darn good outcome, that could be an existential threat for me, right? If but I don't know, like the context for myself and what makes me valuable is I ask a lot of questions. I'm really curious. I'm always learning, and I'm always pulling out of people their own intelligence. So AI looks more like leverage to me, right? It's different. The technology is the same, but it's the context you're already bringing before AI arrives that's going to determine, how whether we see it as a threat or an opportunity.
Um, how can leaders help employees move from the fear to possibility during technological disruption? I mean, I think that's a really major question that people are struggling with right now
Mhm.
because of this great fear of losing their jobs.
Yeah. Well, I'd say the first thing they could do is read my book, because that's really what
Huh.
the whole thing is about. But if I were to answer that like really short, one, I think the most important thing is we acknowledge the fear and not just dismiss it. Like it's there, it's valuable, and sometimes acknowledging what's there actually it, it helps it disappear. what I'm hesitating or laughing about in my head right now is just the amount of corporate training I've done on listening and the amount of sorry to be stereotypical, but more often than not, the men who are like, wait, I don't have to solve the problem. And here we're talking about like, listening in the corporate arena, and they go entirely into the home, right? And but that's the same thing, like just acknowledging something sometimes lets it dissipate. I mean, the age old saying, what you resist persists. And the more we resist the fear, the louder it gets. So acknowledge it, right? And then begin to ask the question, like, don't be afraid to have the question, right? So what's what is ending? What might be changing? What's unknown? What do people really, what's important to them as they start to look into the future? Fear is a prediction that I'm going to lose something that's important to me. So the natural question is, what's important to you that as we move into this next era, there's a place for that, right? So diving actually into the conversations can sometimes help move from fear to a bit of a co-authorship. Actually, it's like at the fair, and I really hope I'm not offending anybody, but at childhood fairs, we called them Chinese finger traps. They were probably not from China, but that's what we used to call them. And you put your fingers in, and then you try to pull them out, and they're stuck,
Yes, yes.
right? And the
Yeah.
only way out of that trap is to go in, right? So you go into it, and then it's released. And I think that's a lot of the same thing, right?
Yeah, it's funny. I just was in China twice. I never saw those things.
I
Um,
Right. Nowadays, I go to name something. Oh, yeah, the Chinese finger traps. I go, oh my gosh, I'm probably going to get fired for saying that because I don't think that was true. Right. But they were those little finger things.
yeah. What are the most common mistakes organizations make when responding to AI-driven change?
Well, there's a lot of mistakes right now, but I don't think we all really know what we're doing yet. So I wouldn't say, oh, you're making a mistake when you're trying to experiment. But what's starting to show up are a couple things. Um, of course, the theme of the book, treating AI as a technology implementation rollout rather than human transition. It is both, right? It is technology and it's human. And so over focusing on the tools and under focusing on the identity and trust and what does it really take to mobilize people, that is the theme of the book. I would say another big thing is not getting clear on governance. Uh, so it's like I'm noticing there's either too little or too much. So there's organizations that have no governance, and it's the wild, wild west. I mean, trade secrets and very confidential data is just being released into the wide, the world. People are doing financial reports with AI and having completely wrong numbers because they don't really understand how AI works, and it's pattern prediction. It's not trying to get things right here. So there's the governance on one side. On the other side is too much control. Like, let us at the top figure out what we need to do, and then we'll tell you how to use it. I think I think the AI providers are starting to catch up with that in terms of security. But look, I look at the same four areas: strategy, structure, culture, leadership. Are you strategy first? And how is AI going to support your strategy? Or are you AI first and trying to fit your strategy into that? Well, that would be a mistake. Are you dealing with the cultural drift that any organization deals with, that you try to put anything new and the cultural drift will bring you back to the old way of operating? Have you done a sufficient job of mobilizing the middle, in any big change? Again, like, those middle managers are what makes or breaks it. And if you just send out a mandate, use AI, you haven't done the real work of enrolling and equipping those middle managers to do a good job with it. Humans game. everything anyway, gamification. So I've heard stories of, you have to use a certain number of tokens every day. And then so what do people do is they game that, and the more tokens, the more they look like they're getting on board, but they're just getting measured by token usage, not by what they produce. There's a lot of mistakes, but we're figuring it out, right?
Absolutely. In chapter 4, context is the lever.
Mm.
You argue that context shapes action. Why is context more powerful than strategy alone?
I think they go together. I mean, sometimes the context won't allow for certain strategies. So it is really important that you see what's the context we're looking through. Like I gave the example of Kodak or Fuji Films, right? Right, Fuji Films, and how powerful the context determined the strategy they took. So I think context and strategy go together, right? Uh, Another way to look at it is strategy tells people where to go, but context determines for people what actions are obvious, what actions are safe, risky, possible, impossible. People don't act consistent with strategy. They act consistent with their context and how strategy fits within their context. So you, you can have an AI strategy, but if people have a context that AI is a threat, they're not going to enact, right? They're going to comply or hide or resist it or game it. If people have a context that AI is um, a almost a power tool or an innovation mechanism for creating new value, then they might experiment. So I think
Um,
you can't separate them really.
can you share an example where changing context transformed an organization's outcome?
I don't have an example where that hasn't happened in working with an organization. In the book, I talk about Forge Fitness, which is uh, a client of ours. Forge Fitness is a made up name because our client is secretly excellent.
Uh-huh.
But if you look at that, even a context, this is a company that was doing really, really well and continues to do well. But their context was one of being a champion, and they were always beating out their competition. But what that had them do is always look in the rearview mirror and to the side, right? And so they would they would knee jerk, they would pivot, and it was always like, I just always want to come out this year as a champion. And they would make more short-term decisions to win this year. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, right? But when we shifted the context to creating a dynasty, well, that's a different way of thinking, because I got to be a champion year after year after year. So now I have to actually start to build the infrastructure and the systems that enable championships to continuously happen. They became more strategic, they became less knee jerk. Now that's huge. I worked with a hospice company with a sales team, and their whole context was, let's be the Kleenex of hospice, which is kind of interesting. Like, people don't say, I want a tissue. They say, give me a
Yeah.
Kleenex, regardless of the brand.
Right.
That was like that it wasn't bad. It was just like, let's be known. But when we shifted the context to creating dignity and honor at the end of life for patients and their families, their sales went up, right? That's a different context, right? So um, I don't actually have an example of an organization I have worked with in which context wasn't the lever.
Um, in chapter 5, you what inspired the development of your new error framework?
Mm-hmm. Actually, we actually have alluded to it. It was initially around people transitioning. I was actually talking to some general officers, two of them in particular, not together but separate, and they were transitioning out of the service. And I remember one saying, like, to be honest, and a three, 4-star general, they're not doing their own dry cleaning, they're not writing their own emails, like none of that
Right.
at the time. This was maybe 20 years ago, 15 years ago. And I remember him saying, like, I don't even know where to fulfill my prescription. I don't know how to do my dry cleaning, right? And I thought, wow, they're really moving into a different phase of life. And so I'm an executive coach. I've had a lot of coaching hours. And so we created this, what's your next chapter about? What's your next era about? And it really worked. And then it worked again. And then executive moving from one uh, uh, kind of role into a totally different role. We did that for her and it worked. And then and it's also based in understanding that people need to complete something before they create. So as I started working with organizations more, and I realized just creating a new vision didn't quite work enough. People kept dragging their past along. Same thing with these transitioning officers. And so we realized that we actually have to complete and honor and kind of put to an end the past before we can create a new future. And the Eero framework has been something that I've now used consistently in our consulting work, and it just enables people to mobilize more quickly and let go of old ways of doing things.
Is that easier, by the way, for people, let's say under 50? Or you didn't find that
No,
made a difference, or the age didn't make a difference?
I actually find that older people get it because you can say, look, your life is made up of several eras. The organization is made up of several eras. I worked with an organization that, they were in startup mode for a long time. And it was like they would talk about themselves as, pioneers. But the problem was this was 8 years in and they kept reinventing the wheel because they were pioneers. So the older individuals actually really got it, like the era of, before kids and
Yeah,
after kids,
right.
totally different. So they actually intuitively get it more the more life you've lived. And so in that company we created, it was the era of being settlers, which initially was like everything they didn't want to be, but then they realized, oh, it's time to codify, it's time to create stability. And older individuals get it. They've been through life.
How does leading a transition differ from managing a change initiative?
Oh yeah, this is the heart of everything. Managing change is, there's a start, a middle, and an end. uh, Leading transition, and this comes from William Bridges' work, by the way, if people wanted to really dive in. Um, Transitions begin with an end. You have to end something, and then you start to create, but it's like you're not going to get there for a while, so you kind of have to go through this messy middle for a long time. So managing change, it's milestones. It's like, here's what we're going to do by then. Oh, here's the training you need to do. Okay, here's the adoption you need to do. Transition is moving from one identity to the next, right? It's, yes, you need to understand the business case to do change, but in transition, you need to say, okay, where's my new home? What does the future look like for me? What relationships are important? Where I find a lot of organizations is they just underwent a big change and they did the managing change part well, but their people are like lost at sea. They left one shore, they don't get the next shore, and they're just kind of floating there, right? So when you come in and you say, hey, that's the shore you left, let's honor it, let's like understand that was what was your identity, how were you successful, what partnerships were important, and they just you kind of start to package almost where what they're leaving, and they can see it and they go, oh, okay, well, what's this next shore about? What's that future about? Well, it's about this. What partnerships are important? And it helps the human brain transition into the new. That's really different than, we're going to roll this out at the director level, then the manager level, and then with the sales team, and then la 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 la. It's really different, but they go together. They're both super important.
In chapter 6, you discuss the convergence of AI with other exponential
Exponential.
technologies. Why is convergence more important than any single technology?
Yeah, I think the real disruption, um, you know, uh, I was at a conference, and I can't remember who said it, but one of these futurists, right, like a Ray Kurzweil or said, "Hey, look, the next 10 years, we're going to see the same amount of change as we've seen in the last 100 years." And that, whoa, if you think about what's been 100 years, right? Where were we in uh, 1926 and where are we today? And we're going to see that much change in the next 10 years. And part of that is these technologies converging, right? So AI by itself is powerful, but when you combine that with robotics, you now have a physical embodiment of a technology. And then you add sensors, and now the robotic can sense, and then you add quantum computing. And I mean, it's just like it's the convergence. It's not just a one exponential technology, it's several that is shifting the very world we're living in.
So, I have a couple more closing questions here.
Sure.
What has been the most unexpected lesson AI has taught you, not about technology, but about humans?
Um, Well, I think AI has taught me that we don't know ourselves very well, and we've been pretty narrow in how we've defined human value. There's so much intangibles, and there's so much that we've suppressed about the human intelligence that we're now finding has a lot of value, but we're very underdeveloped in it. We haven't developed our children and our education systems. Um, if we just define ourselves by output or what we can accomplish or expertise, it's really narrow, right? But we're not just processors of information. We are meaning makers. We are context creators. We are moral agents. We care, and that's something that AI can't do. Is AI can't care, therefore AI can't make good decisions, right? So I think AI is forcing us to better understand what does it mean to be human and what's the unique contribution of human.
What industries are you think are going to be the most disrupted by AI?
I I don't I can't really think of much of an industry that's not. I think every industry is going to be impacted. Um, I think any industry that's built on knowledge work, repetitive decision making, for sure, physical labor and labor shortages, IP proprietary data, that's going to be difficult. So, what comes to mind immediately: healthcare, financial services, education, retail. I don't know. I can't think of one that isn't, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I think everybody feels the same. Here's my last question for you. When future generations look back on this moment in history, what do you hope they will say leaders got right about navigating the age of AI?
Well, I hope they say we didn't sleepwalk through it. I hope they say that leaders were honest about the risks, um, that they took a bold stand, um, that they learned uh, the discipline about keeping human fundamental cares at the center. I hope they say something about, we used AI to expand, the human experience rather than diminish it. Um, I probably ultimately, I hope they say that we understood that the human future belonged to us, and it wasn't something that was going to happen to us, and it wasn't something that AI could create for us.
I really appreciate you taking the time. Again, thank you for your service to country.
Mm. Mm.
And I hope a lot of people will pick up this book because I think it's just so incredibly timely right now, especially
Mhm.
for business leaders of our for-profit and nonprofit, anybody's leading people. So thank you again for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much, Mark. I really enjoyed your questions.